this chapter is really talking about the importance of inclusiveness for the UN decision making, for it to be considered legitimate. And of course, we discussed in our third month about the World Parliamentary Assembly when we had Andreas Bummel join us. And so, you know, it's often said by our group that the UN Charter starts with the word "we the peoples," and then everything thereafter is really based on nation states. And so how do we get that "we the people's" voice in? And that's a lot about what this chapter is about. So Joe shares two proposals for non-state actors, the one that takes most of his chapter and the one that is maybe the most flushed out is about civil society coordinating councils. And then he also talks about the global compacts and the benefits, but also the potential dangers of that idea and how there might be more transparency or accountability. So first, he's talking about global citizens having a voice through civil society organizations, NGOs or CSOs, and non-governmental organizations. And a lot of you know that last year there was the Global Challenges Foundation held a contest. People could submit their proposals for how to reform global governance. And Joe actually submitted 2 proposals for that. Neither one of them won the prize, but one was generally on the concept of weighted voting, and the second one was on this idea of civil society coordinating councils. So because of that, he flushed out a little bit more of his thinking and also updated statistics. So the book has smaller numbers for the number of NGOs than what I'm quoting here, which is based on his proposal from last summer. There are over 10 million NGOs currently in the world. 4,500 of them, mostly international NGOs, have been given various levels of accreditation within the UN. And Joe explains briefly in this chapter, there are 3 levels of accreditation and what kind of rights that gives the different accredited NGOs. So annually, these organizations, all of these NGOs around the world, produce millions and millions and millions of pages of reports and documents, and it's just completely impossible for anyone to read all of that. And so therefore, the really big names are the ones, you know, Amnesty International or Avaz, which are wonderful, reputable organizations that do great work. But, you know, there are also many NGOs that are on the ground, that are really in the field with very important topics that aren't on the radar of almost anyone, that are extremely important. And so Joe is trying to look at how can we, you know, make all those voices heard. So he, on page 181, I'm just giving a quote here in the book, he says, only a small proportion, those with a strong membership base, ample funding, and sophisticated PR capabilities presently have a reasonable chance of winning out in the competition for attention. Under the current system, and that was the end of his quote, so I'm saying under the current system, politically marginalized groups or critical issues that are not in the mainstream political thought are just completely ignored. So he goes on to share examples of NGO coalitions that have been very successful in having some kind of impact. For instance, the International Campaign to Ban Landmines, International HIV/AIDS Alliance, the NGO Coalition on the International Criminal Court, which of course many of us are very aware of, and WFM continues to lead that very large coalition of NGOs. And NGOs have had tremendous impact on the environmental movement. Not enough to save ourselves yet, but from the Earth Summit in '72 all the way up to the Paris Climate Accord, you know, obviously NGOs have been a huge aspect of that movement. So he talked about the strengths that NGOs bring to global decision making, and he quotes Kofi Annan. And by the way, you all know he very recently passed away. Joe and I and others here were able to see him just a couple months ago because he was here in St. Paul at Macalester College. They're Institute for Global Citizenship became the Kofi Annan Institute for Global Citizenship. So they had an unveiling, and then he came and had a dialogue that we could attend with the president of McAllister. So even though that was quite a trek for Joe with his oxygen tank and the whole bit, I'm really glad we were able to do that. So Kofi Annan says, quote, they being NGOs, can lead and say things that I cannot say. They can lead and say, we cannot operate in the field without our essential partners, the NGOs. So I think that's, while those in the UN system may know things, they can't necessarily politically say those things. NGOs are able to have that bold voice. Of course, NGOs do not have any decision-making power, so their power comes from, it's soft power. Their power comes from their capacity to argue, to propose, to experiment, to denounce, and to be exemplary models themselves. Potential challenges to increasing the voice of NGOs, he talks about, and this is on page 186, a few quotes from him. He says, in all parts of the world, there are NGOs whose bona fides are suspect. Some are led by unreasonable zealots, narcissists, or corrupt charlatans. Others were created as vehicles for providing employment and funding for staff with little aptitude or dedication to their organization's ostensible purpose. And he also talks about gongos, which are government organized NGOs. So they're NGOs, but really, the puppets of their home government. And he says the independence and integrity of NGOs may be compromised by their acceptance of contributions from corporations, whose economic interests might be adversely affected by the adoption of specific policies that the NGO may, absent such funding, choose to promote. And then last he talked about, well, I'll read it here. While NGOs are often touted for their alleged ability to bring expert scientific and technical knowledge to bear on major issues, the fact that individual NGOs often work at cross purposes indicates that at least some of those positions are ill-advised. So how do you sort through that, and what are really the expert opinions? So anyway, Joe's proposal with this huge plethora of millions of NGOs around the world is that that the UN system creates a set of of civil society coordinating councils. And he proposes that they be thematic, and he's proposing 5 particular ones: human rights, the environment, development, peace and security, and democratic governance. And any particular NGO may overlap and not be focused only on one of those. And he indicates that they're certainly free to join more than one of the councils, as long as they are able to fit the requirements of a member of that council. So membership would be open to all NGOs. There would be a modest membership fee prorated based on their financial resources. And he also says NGOs headquartered in countries whose per capita GNI is above the global average would pay an additional fee to subsidize participation by those who are headquarters in poorer countries. They would be required to submit an annual report of their activities to show that they're actually in line with the thinking of the code of conduct of that council. And as I said, they could be a member of more than one of the CSCCs. So obviously transparency, fairness, accountability, and statutory legitimacy would be absolutely essential for this to be a good idea. And membership on the council should be balanced in regard to both regional and gender composition. And he's recommending that, so, thousands of these organizations could join one of these 5 councils. However, the actual representatives on the council would be, he's suggesting between 50 and 125 individuals, and they would be representative. There's a formula, you know, Joe and his love of formulas and the weighted voting, so that's included here on how that would be chosen. So every one of the members would be represented, but there would be a, you know, 50 to 125. If you get more than that, it becomes rather unwieldy. So benefits of the system, a huge one that he talked a lot about in his proposal to Global Challenges Foundation as well, is the two-way communication. So it's not just top down, but it's also not just bottom up. There has to be a flow. So each council would receive, here I'll read this, receive, discuss, harmonize, and prioritize the recommendations based on all of these different reports from the different member NGOs of their council. And then they would compile a report that would go to the proper UN agency or agencies. And, you know, within a combined report, there may become a majority opinion which would be presented, but there would absolutely be an opportunity within that report to also share dissenting opinions. So it's not just like majority rule and 49% are listened to. That report would include, you know, an overview of all of the opinions. And then the organ in the UN that receives this report would be required to discuss it, collaborate about it, and actually present a written response to it. So it can't just go there and sit on a shelf. There would be a requirement that there'd be a response, and then they would also forward it on to any other agencies that they felt should, you know, would benefit from its impact, its message. And then this, you know, he made the point also that any NGO or coalition would absolutely remain, would retain the ability to make contact with any part of the UN system on their own. So it's not now that they have to go through their coordinating council to get the message out. Any organization would be completely free to do their continued relationships with different agencies. Okay, and then, so that's what I'm going to share about the coordinating councils. As far as his second kind of line of thinking is talking about the impact of the private commercial sector, corporations in other words, and the strengths of that. It can infuse the global governance system with significant financial resources, and it certainly has been in the last number of years. And then guidelines for being part of this UN system can require corporations to conduct their business with human rights, labor standards, environmental protection considerations, not just their financial bottom line. Now, I'm sure all of you are well aware that there's great concerns about the Global Compact. And when David Lionel and Gail and I think the ones on this call, were at the Democracy Convention. Was that just last summer or was it 2 summers ago? I would say to a person, everyone there was sort of an implied assumption that a Global Compact was absolutely evil. So there's a certain segment of the liberal community that feels that way without question. So concerns, lack of accountability, and they can leverage their financial power to bend programs and priorities to their own advantage. The Global Compact system was launched during Kofi Annan's time as Secretary General. Participating corporations are expected, but here's the problem, not legally required to incorporate ethical principles and submit an annual accounting of their progress. So Joe, then on page 196, this is nearing the end of his chapter, he said, many critics look with disdain on the whole enterprise, regarding it essentially as a UN sellout to the business world, notwithstanding its demonstrable benefits to millions of people throughout the world. On the other hand, some in the business community worry that the initiative is an attempt at global regulation. So Joe, as I said, didn't flesh out this idea in great detail, but he talked about expanding the mandate and the resources of the UN Secretariat Ethics Office. So there would be accountability, and there would be actual a requirement to not just a nice idea, but there's no follow through on their ethical standards. And also requiring a formal ECOSOC approval for projects that exceed a certain budgetary level, or those projects that are affecting more than a stipulated number of people, that there could be requirement to approve those projects. So that's a pretty good overview of the chapter. We can at this point discuss anything any of you would like to discuss. I think you all know that I'm no expert on any of this. I'm a layperson who just gets excited about Joe's book and his ideas. So don't look to me for answers, but I think we can have a great discussion. And I'll just, the two questions in the study guide really are getting at these two proposals. One is, presently there is nothing remotely like the proposed CSCCs, the coordinating councils. Do you think that so complicated a system could work? Would its recommendations be regarded as fair? Would they be wise? How could fairness and wisdom be encouraged among such councils? So that's sort of all encompassing with the idea of the coordinating councils. And then secondly, the global compact system is already well established and has had some major successes, but might it not represent an unacceptable threat to local modes of production and governance? If so, what changes are needed? We don't have to address those directly, but actually those summarize pretty well the points in the chapter. So with that, I'm just going to open it up for any of you, and I will unmute all at this point. If we get a lot of background noise, I can mute, but I think the best way is for all of us to be available to discuss.
I have a very simple, basic question. Is the description you just gave, is that the latest version from Joe, or is that the version in the book, or is that one and the same?
Right.
What I just gave is straight from the book, other than the statistics that I shared at the beginning in terms of the number of NGOs and accredited NGOs.
Right.
But yeah, so I didn't go into expanding. I've stuck to the book. Good question.
I'm torn. I have a question about the figure on page 192. The real thing I'd like to get into is my concern about corporations. But before I go there, this and I think I noticed you had this in your attachment that just came out just before the figure.
Yeah, it's in color, which doesn't necessarily communicate better. It's just much prettier.
I keep looking at this thinking I'll see the 5 coordinating councils, the 5 NGO coordinating councils, and I don't. Do I, or do
no? Great point. This is for the Human Rights Council only.
Oh,
so
this is
if you see the second level from the top, he's showing how it would work one of the 5.
Oh my gosh, I see. Thank you. I got it now.
And then therefore he's showing, the highest level, the UN level, he's showing what would be the logical agencies that would receive the report from this Human Rights Coordinating Council.
And then there would be 5 of these networked together.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So
yeah. So I don't know, it looks complicated, but really it's, the bottom level is just all of the NGOs who pay the fee and agree to the, ethical guidelines and are going to be a part of this. And then
at least it isn't a
level is interesting because that, for instance, for human rights, there's going to be indigenous rights, there's going to be LGBT rights, there's going to be, women's rights, there's going to be different coalitions that will naturally form around different aspects of human rights. So that's that second level.
Okay,
the third level is where it all gets pulled together into one report, and also, I don't think I shared that from my notes here, but not only will they, push information to the UN, the UN can also come to them when they would like advice on certain thorny issues that have come up, and that could happen any time of the year. So while they would be required to, you know, combine on all this information into a report each year, the UN could come to them at any time about something related to the topic of that council, and then maybe it would go to maybe it's appropriate that it goes to the indigenous rights ad hoc coalition level, and a particular, you know, part of that human rights coordinating council would submit something.
So is this concept of the NGO coordinating councils something that only Joe is promoting? Does anyone else promote this as well, or is it gaining any traction? It's Joe's idea.
I mean, I think the same way that his Security Council idea, instead of should we have 12 members or 15 members, let's have 25 members, which always means some small subset of countries. He's got this revolutionary idea that you can have regions that includes all countries.
Right.
Same way he's thinking, okay, there's so much wealth of it. You know, I feel from knowing Joe so well now, the fact that he lived in India for a couple of years doing his field work, going on his bicycle to 200 little villages, you know, I mean, what an adventure. And he's been in 100+ countries. I mean, and he did even his was his bachelor's or master's thesis was on I'm going to forget the names, but, you know, certain communities outside of Pennsylvania, the Dutch, I'm forgetting the name. Not Amish either, but, you know, these small
Mennonite.
Pardon?
Mennonite.
Mennonites. That's the one I was trying to think of. Thank you, Lucy. You know, that was some of his beginning. So he's very sensitive to the common people and what that means outside of the realm of our own personal life experience in the good old USA. So he's really, you know, he's aware that, for instance, a very small NGO in almost an unknown country is on the ground with real people and has something very valuable to share. So some of you may know of something. I don't know of anyone else even imagining that all of the civil society voices could be heard. David?
Well, you know, I was there in 2000 at the Millennium Forum, and there was a huge evolving from the landmine agreement and the Earth Summit, and that was a kind of a maximum point of the civil society involvement there, and Kofi Annan was very supportive. But, sorry, when George W. Bush came in, not just him, but this whole complex of governments really wanted to squelch this and stop these conferences that had so much import and brought too much progressive policy with too much juice behind it to the United Nations, and it wasn't properly defended against the impact of that. And so really strikingly, in the last 18 years, there has been no advance, or very minimal, of the structural role in NGOs at the UN. They now speak very regularly. They have a whole thing to get a speaker at this or that event, but that's it. There's no, it's just extraordinary. There's not an institutional, just like this content. Don, as far as I'm aware, I don't know everything, there isn't even a proposal afoot for the structural, the institutionalization of the NGO role. And as Nancy just said, there are thousands and thousands, besides the 4,500, which is a manageable number at the UN. So this is why this is extraordinarily valuable. And for the NGOs to kind of coalesce, not counting on Kofi Annan was extraordinarily helpful. He made a huge difference, but no one else since then has been as focused on coalescing and organizing the NGOs so they could funnel into the UN, just like Joe proposes. That's very correct. But no, without the Secretary General there organizing that, it hasn't happened since. It's extraordinary, and it still needs to happen just as much as it did in 2000. It got right to a certain point, and boom, still gone.
Well, don't you think the Paris Climate Accord, though, had tremendous NGO
Yes,
behind it?
but yes, it does. It isn't as though there's no impact. I say it's not institutionalized, not organized, and there isn't, as far as I know, in the Paris Climate Accord, for instance, a monitoring function written in of the NGOs to formalize that each of their governments is doing this. It's there, but it's not inherent and integrated and built in. I just don't think it is. And it could be and should be. That's exactly what's needed, is to really get the NGOs to be effective in dealing with their governments on what they do, their local governments and the overall governments. But those governments don't really want that input to be coherent. That would move policy out of the comfort zone of the current elites who are running the show everywhere.
Gail, we can't see you, so just jump in when you're...
Oh, yeah, sure. No, I don't have anything at
Okay.
this moment.
Sure. Donna.
I just want to share something so everyone's aware that you mentioned earlier the role of the WFM. So to make sure we're all on the same page, Citizens for Global Solutions is kind of the primary U.S. member of the World Federalist Movement, which is the international body, the international NGO, if you will. And I just come to understand how important WFM is to the International Criminal Court itself.
The Secretariat.
Yeah, so yeah, the Secretariat. And so when Bill Pace wants to retire from WFM, you know, the International Criminal Court is weighing in on who replaces him. I mean, I don't think I really appreciated how critical the role of WFM in the operations of not only in getting it out there, but in keeping it running. So, I mean, it's an example of an NGO being in a really important role for the International Criminal Court operations.
Larry.
I want to make the distinction also, after what Donna said, that the World Federalist Movement, Institute for Global Policy, is the lead advocate, coordinating body for promoting the ICC, and the Citizens for Global Solutions, prior to our demise, our meltdown, had been the primary coordinator of the Washington Working Group for the International Criminal Court. And we ceded that now to the Baha'is. The Baha'is are now the primary coordinator for the International Criminal Court Washington Working Group, advocating the ICC inside the United States. And but for a long time, the World Federalists and the Citizens for Global Solutions was the coordinator for the ICC coalition in the United States. I also want to say that I think you've done a great job of reprising this chapter in Joe's book, and I want to report my own visceral overwhelm about the information presented here about how many NGOs there are, about how insignificant 99.9% of them are relative to the bigger policy-making conversations that go on within the UN system or anywhere in the world for that matter. And what an amazing job Joe has done over and over in taking these vastly unwieldy masses of data and pictures of how the world actually is, and trying to produce an answer, trying to produce a way forward that would be a progress in bringing voice to the people all over the world via the NGO and the NGO process. It's just astonishing. And it just shows me the depth of his understanding and of his fearlessness in proposing ideas
Yeah.
that nobody else has done
Yeah.
as a way to move the system ahead. And it's just hats off to Joe, and then thanks so much to you, Nancy, for producing this summation of the book and for the outline and for your leadership in this. Really appreciate it.
Here, here. Thanks, Nancy.
Yes, thank you, Nancy.
Lucy, I have a question. To what extent, if any, are there NGOs aside from WFM which are picking up on implementing this proposal?
Good luck.
How many even World Federalists are picking up on it?
I have another
It's such an uphill battle. Larry, were you going to say something about that?
Yeah, so when I see something like this and I hear what, the questions, Lucy's, David Lionel's questions about, is anyone else thinking this way? Is anyone else promoting this? What's going on? To me, it looks like a vacuum where leadership is required and where somebody needs to step in. And I'm always looking for, well, what is the significant role next for CGS in the United States? And I'm wondering if the idea of coordinating the NGOs, of being a grand coalition builder, again, with some kind of a structural approach, might be a soft spot where we could make a difference, where we could become known as, like we were in the days of WIC, the early days of WIC, Washington Working Group for the International Criminal Court, if we could become the WIC of NGO organization and promotion of a structural community, a structured community of NGOs that uses these principles that Joe has promoted here and or designed here, that we could become the promoter of a structure for NGO coordination in the United States. It's just, what shows up, in my mind as I look at the answer. When somebody says, is anybody doing this? And somebody else says no, all of a sudden I go, well, somebody can. Not only should, but somebody can, and we're looking for how to be relevant in the world. That is one of the main things that's going on in CGS these days is this looking around at where we can be relevant and what it is that's going to attract people and resources and attention. And to me, stepping into the void like this is how we've done it in the past.
Can I add that I think that goal of getting NGOs to rally round and provide leadership for them in doing that is something that would fit in quite well with my intended book tour. I'd be talking about how this has been. I was quite aware when I was working in the UN and vis-a-vis WFM and also the UN Secretariat of the different activities of NGOs, but to be able to explain what this new concept is would tidy things up and give more NGOs, particularly the ones we want to succeed, like churches and good causes and so forth. It would give them more of a explicit role, and we could talk that up. I mean, that's what I was thinking of my tour doing, that I would go to different cities where the local World Federalists, if there are any, would rally groups to have discussions with me about my book and also about this plan. This plan would be a definite positive
Yes, of course.
thing to add. And the fact that we need that leadership, and CGS needs to become involved with creating the leadership, is very mutually beneficial.
Donna?
Go ahead, Jeff.
If it's okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about the UN Global Compact to see if anybody can give us an update. Is it still happening? I know it was, Joe says, the book says it was started in the year 2000 under Kofi Annan, however you pronounce his name. Is it, you know, what is the status? And I mean, I know, Nancy, you said it, that at some conference, I mean, it just seems to reek to me of Citizens United problems of having corporations be like people and
Well, yeah. I mean, having talked to Joe, because I lean your way. I mean, you can't deny the amount of good. Like he says, millions of people. What, for instance, what Bill Gates has done with the in the health field, right? Has, you know,
but that wasn't foundation, that was
The foundation.
yeah. Pardon? Well, there, I mean, so corporations getting involved, there are many ways that it's been positive. And so I think the tendency of the left to just discount it and assume it's evil, there's something more practical in between this is great and great hesitation about its potential evil. You know, I guess that's what I'm getting at. The UN system has such a little amounts of money as it stands right now. So honestly, I don't know what, there's a huge, I mean, I think it's more than 50% of what the UN does is because donations have been made. Isn't that true? I'm sorry, I don't know all my statistics, but.
Probably much more than that.
Dave.
Well, let me say that whatever there was is now all rolled into the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. That's the hot ticket at the UN that they're really putting their energy and influence behind, and organizational content. So they want to enroll corporations in being of service to manifesting the goals. Okay, so, and the UN just simply, there is no force besides the UN, any other force that can in general make corporations do anything. You know, some of the financial controls exist, and there is the WTO, which has been too much enabling corporations. That's the same thing, that they can sue in a corporate court for profits. So that they supposedly would lose some environmental regulations. So it's true that the Global Compact is inadequate, but you're ending up with this fantastic power that the transnational corporations have anyway. Whether you like it or not, they are really more powerful than governments. And it's in the norms like the digital norm that everybody has to fit into, and telecommunications, and a long list of other elements in order to make the global economy for the profit of the corporations work, has created an integration. And we can do this kind of thing, Zoom, and people can communicate, and NGOs can put themselves out on the web. These millions of organizations can, and that was all built by the corporations in order to make profit for themselves. I got that, but that infrastructure is still there. So our focus needs to be on strengthening the Global Compact so it is more specific, requires the reporting at least, and begins to move toward how could you regulate internationally the actions of transnational corporations on pollution, on decent wages, long list of stuff that needs to be there and isn't there. And the Global Compact is all you've got to sort of get in that direction so far. So that's the way I would look at it. But the left not dealing with international structure is, in the absence of this kind of progressive intelligence applied to it, the corporations just do it, whatever they want to do, exclusively for profit. And you end up with Bill Gates having billions of dollars, and Bezos with some consciousness, and Bezos says he's heading toward $1 trillion himself personally and with no consciousness. And there's nothing to stop at that today.
Tom Hastings, I want to see if your group has anything to add.
Yes, I wanted to point out what the ECOSOC, E-C-O-C-O-C, that's mentioned, accredits NGOs, and the book mentioned that there were 3,000. It's now up. I Googled it. You just Google what is ECOSOC, and they're now 5,000 of them have been accredited by the UN as of 2016, and CGS and the CGS Education Fund are both registered under as NGOs of the 5,000 that are registered now, or as of 2016. So I thought that was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know more about ECOSOC and whether how it's functioning.
Well, that's one of Joe's chapters, and he recommends it. Yeah, so we'll cover that, ECOSOC.
So it's a different chapter?
Right, yeah.
Well, about ECOSOC and how Joe recommends that it become ESEC, in other words, having an environmental function added into it. But yeah, and then there are 3 different levels of being an NGO recognized by the UN system, and some of them have observer status only. Some of them can actually submit agenda topics. Larry?
Yeah, that's right.
Just as an anecdote, the Economic and Social Council, Glenn Olds was the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the Economic and Social Council of the UN prior to his being chairman of the board of the World Federalist Association.
Wow. Can I ask?
What was his name again?
Glenn Olds, Dr. Glenn Olds.
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 Gail, was that your voice?
And he had been.
No.
Oh, I'm hearing somebody's voice. But anyway, Larry, go ahead.
Oh, and he had been president of Kent State University. He was named president right after the tragedy there during the Vietnam War. Anyway, Glenn Olds was one of our main players in the 80s, actually in the 90s.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Bonnie Selway. We like the Carter Center, Jimmy Carter Center. And what would be the advantage for them being part of one of these coordinating councils? Wouldn't it be better if I just give my money to the Carter Center and they don't have any report to the UN? Because they're very specific. You know, they give inoculations, they have medicine for a preventable eye disease. All you need to do is put this medicine in, you won't be blind. I mean, they have 100% effectiveness on that. So are they not an NGO? They're a foundation? The Jimmy Carter Center? What's the difference? What's the difference between an NGO? Another one would be Doctors Without Borders. Is that an NGO? Yeah, it is.
Yes.
Well, then I bet the Carter Center is.
Yeah.
Sure, it's a foundation. They're all NGOs.
It's just for eye disease, and he has it down from like 100,000 cases to 5. And why would he want to be part of one of these coordinating councils?
Well, so being a part of it doesn't negate what they're doing as an individual NGO. And in fact, being an NGO that has significant impact by becoming part of a council, their modeling, their example, their voice would become part of something bigger and could have some positive influence. But it wouldn't negate what any organization is doing on their own. It just allows for a discussion, a combination, you know, I mean, if a large number of NGOs have a certain feeling that something is the most important topic to focus on right now, that gives it a lot more impact than just one organization saying that. So
Okay.
this would not in any fashion negate or water down the positive impact of any of the individual NGOs.
It wouldn't be required. It wouldn't be like you have to register and you have to do this. It's only if they want to, if, you know, only if they're feeling like they need a louder voice. I think that's part of what Joe called it, giving them a voice. So people who don't need voices can just keep doing their thing. But if you think you need a voice, voices for all, he called it in this section. So I think it's more for the NGOs who need a voice to get their work done and don't have one.
Yeah, I mean, and Jimmy Carter is one of the elders. You all know about the elders, right? I mean, he's well respected around the world. So Jimmy Carter and his foundation have an awful lot of impact on its own. But there are many NGOs where that wouldn't be true. And I would hope that if there were councils that an organization like that would join, they retain their own voice as they have now, but then they become part of something that's coordinated around these different issues, and it strengthens it.
Okay, thanks.
That was going to be my comment as well, is that it seems like instead of everyone trying to reinvent a wheel, you can just see the wheels that are turning and doing some positive things, and they would have things to bring to the table, I would think, for a broader discussion.
Could you speak more loudly, whoever that was?
I'm Georgia.
Can you speak louder?
Or maybe if you lean over so we can see your mouth, it helps.
Yeah.
I was just saying that it was just reiterating what was said, I guess, is that instead of every person that, or every organization that actually joins, you don't always have to reinvent the wheel. If you see the wheels that are turning, you can gain input from that and see what works and what doesn't work and how it applies to your particular organization, rather than thinking everything has to be so independent. It's more coordinated effort to have the success that the ones, you know, in certain areas, that the ones who, like the Carter Center, that already sets an example of what can work for them. It's just,
I've got Larry and David raising their hand. Go ahead, Larry.
Sure. Yeah, the reason to coordinate and bring cohesiveness to the NGO community, such as the Carter Center or Gates Foundation or the little tiny ones like us, is so that we have a way to influence decision-making at the UN level, so that we have a way of helping to guide policy. By we, I mean the NGO community. If it is coordinated, it becomes stronger in its ability to influence policy, including UN reform. That ultimately is the reason why coordination is valuable, so that actual change will occur at high levels of governance as a result of NGO activity. Things that would not happen with people trying to communicate on their own, or NGOs trying to communicate to the UN on their own.
I'll call on you next, David, but let me just say, thinking of a local example, in Minnesota for, I don't know, a good number of years, probably 20, we've had the Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers. Joe was actually one of the co-founders of that. So it's about 70 peace and justice organizations, mostly in the Twin Cities, but some outside of the Twin Cities. And, you know, each of them, some of them are stronger than others, some are very small. Some of them are very actively involved with the Alliance, some aren't. But Gail's on the leadership board for MAP. And I know right now they're really discussing how can they have more joint impact, because they support each other's events, like they'll advertise each other's events, maybe attend them, but in reality, of course, there's so many organizations that were in some ways competing with each other for dollars, for audience. But the leadership group now is really discussing how can they be more effective. And for instance, when events are happening in the world that are against peace, can they have more of a united voice so that MAP actually becomes you know, a spokesperson for certain messages. So the Alliance has the potential for a lot more impact with the media and with society than any individual organization could. David?
Could talk about a lot of stuff. That was very good, Nancy. Specifically on the Carter Center, they model for not that much money on the scale of governments. They've eradicated river blindness. You know, as the lady said, 100,000 people are going blind, and nobody's going blind to speak of, you know, 100 people around the planet. And that's one NGO focusing, raising money, and fixing it. Well, if the humanity were doing that on a regular and sustained basis to solve the problems of this or that community around the world, that just shows you and models how effective we could be if we were able to operate. And Larry, on your thing about, I think that's totally right, and it would be a good role for CGS but it's extremely ambitious, and there's a lot of NGOs and there's a lot of power in different NGOs at the UN. And I discovered that they didn't want to carry on with this structural evolution because of the turf that this or that NGO has already accomplished for itself at the UN, and that's what I found stopped some of the movement. So, but Larry, the specific thing that I was interested in was the Millennium Forum and the Global Civil Society Forum, because if you had a gathering at the UN formalized by invitation from the Secretary General, as in 2000, and you did that annually, not the DPI conference, which is the NGO, UN talking to the NGOs, I found out. That's it. There's no other way. If the NGOs were getting together at the UN coherently, collectively every year, that would enable then this structure of input to happen more reliably. Otherwise, it's extraordinarily difficult to organize that because the NGOs are all over the place. And as I said, they're not coherent. But if they gathered every year delegates to a body, then you could start to build that structure under that or in relation to that process. Otherwise, it's very hard to get people together. But to get them to come to a conference that was about organizing the NGOs in relation to UN, that I think could happen. And CGS could have a modest role as one organization proposing that idea on the way towards structure. Joe's structure is a great, well thought out, beautifully thought out.
Not a bad idea, Tom.
Donna, I see you. Anyone else who hasn't spoken yet?
Anybody else, right? I know.
Okay, go ahead, Donna.
I just want to say I used my phone and Googled. I found if you go to www.unglobalcompact.org, there is a website for the Global Compact. It says there are 9,819 companies from 164 different countries. And one of their areas is governance. And one of their topics under governance is the rule of law. So maybe we need to think about this more. Maybe these are allies. Maybe we need to open our minds.
Definitely.
So anyway, there's even a contact person there from the global, UN Global Compact.org for this governance and the rule of law topic. So just saying, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is Gail.
Oh, go ahead, Gail. Good.
Oh, I just want to make the point that the rule of law, you know, we're striving for a rule of law, but not all laws have always been, you know,
Good.
progressive or humane. And for example, under apartheid, there was segregation and discrimination that was all legal, and the same in this country.
Mm-hmm.
So we also need, you know, we need to do more than just promote the rule of law, but also the humanitarian bases of those laws.
But yeah, that is definitely part of the Global Compact. They talk about human rights and justice and
Just law.
societies. So, you know, yes, I agree, you have to be careful, but I think this looks very encouraging. From what
I'm
I've
sure-
a little bit.
I'm sure many of you know of David Corton. I
Yes,
think magazine comes out from his organization, but probably his most famous book is called When Corporations Rule the World. When we held the Creating a Workable World conference back in 2015, David was one of the speakers we reached out to ask if he would join us. And I mean, basically, I think his feeling is the UN is so corrupt that he didn't have an interest in working within it, in a sense.
Wow.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm just thinking that this topic, none of us are probably experts enough to come to very concise conclusions. It might be worth a book club topic. I would imagine we should continue as we are with Joe's book, but I think it would be great to circle back to this topic because I think it's very important, and I think we should be informed on the Global Compact and what its benefits are, but what its dangers are, and what various factors think about it. I would at least find that extremely interesting.
Nancy, is the Global Compact new? Because I didn't remember that from Joe's book when I read it a couple of years ago now.
It's in his book, and he talks about it starting
On page 195.
Yeah.
Oh,
right. Yep.
Yeah, it was founded in the year 2000.
I mean, he starts talking about Ted Turner providing the $1 billion, which was not, it was just offered to support the UN without any particular agenda. And then Bill Gates Foundation donated money, but that was specifically toward HIV, AIDS, and other specific diseases. And then shortly thereafter, the Global Compact was formed. And now, according to his book, there are 6,000 businesses in 135 countries. I'm guessing that's gone up.
She just said.
Up to 9,819 companies in 164 countries.
Yeah.
Right.
So, but there is that danger that they want to look good, and therefore they can put on their, you know, their glossy
Absolutely.
website how they're a part of this and they're so ethical when they're not really.
Right.
So
yeah, no trouble seeing the danger. I think I have to open my mind to the possibilities is where I'm coming from.
Right.
Absolutely.
Well, and yeah, that's something I appreciate having hung out with Joe. I mean, he is extremely practical. Real work. He's very rooted in the real world. At the same time, he's idealistic, obviously. But you know, if you just kind of say they're all bad, I mean, they have done untold numbers of really good things. The Carter Foundation is one example, and I would say Bill Gates on many levels. And so, anyway, it's worth becoming more knowledgeable about, and I plan to look into it more myself, but we might consider a book club topic in the future.
If I could just share, the last sentence in Joe's book on this chapter is this development under the aegis of the UN-sanctioned Global Compact program offers both great future hope and great future risk. So I think, you know, yeah, it's got both. Interesting.
Well, circling back to what Larry was saying about maybe this gives us some ideas, and maybe it was more I guess, about the coordinating councils, an idea of what CGS could do. I'm not sure CGS could just sort of take on that. However, I'm thinking the Model UN program or the UN 2020 program, whatever that may become, are vehicles for us to then bring up those ideas. It could be tried out with the Model UN program. So I'm not sure if just CGS sort of starting to promote it would get us far. I'm just trying to go in a little more deeply on how would we actually do that.
Yeah, I do want to say thanks to David Lionel, I think, that, you know, our CGS website lists 7 items from Joe's book, and this is one of them, the Coordinating Council. I believe that was you, David, who where we did that. So
right now there's a voiceover as part of that larger video, but I think it has only the, I know there's a new thing on that I coalesced about the Millennium Forum and the Global Civil Society Forum, which I feel is not in Joe's book at all, but fits very well
I'm gonna go visit my friend.
Coordinate Council. That's all. But I don't think that is on the website there yet, good as it is as an idea.
Bob is raising his hand there.
One of the topics that Mr. Schwartzberg mentions here is the kind of animosity between the NGOs from the global north and the global south. And I was wondering if anybody had any experience working with NGOs from the south, like the ones that come to mind too, or for me, or either from the United States or Italy or something. Has anybody worked with the global south, or is that animosity resolving itself?
Guess not. Gail, you're on mute, Gail. Or is Gail on mute?
Oh,
Gail's often the person who talks global south around us.
yeah, let me
She's our
unmute.
global south woman.
Oh, yeah, well, my point is just the global south perspective is oftentimes ignored. And a lot of us are really unaware of it altogether. And it can be 180 degrees different than what we are thinking. So that's why it's important in my mind.
I do know that the global south is represented in WFM, correct? WFM does have
Yes.
representatives from the global south there, but in terms of an NGO from the global south, I mean, I guess they're in Jersey.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any particular NGOs from the global south.
Well, this is Lucy. When I went to the UN conference in Johannesburg, which was organized around environmental themes, I forget the exact title of it, but there were a lot of member states there from all the global south, but there are also NGOs, and the World Federalists had quite a good showing there, and people were working together very well. And one of the organizations I've been active in, which is called Economists for Peace and Security, has a very important opinion leader who happens to be from an Irish family that went to South Africa only about 50 years ago or so. But he was active in the ANC and a good friend of Desmond Tutu. And, you know, there is a lot of interaction at that UN conference between the global north and the global south, as they were both perceived in, I think it was 2002. Right. So, you know, there is a lot of activity before the global south became so messed up with the US invasion of Iraq and the whole situation in the Middle East and the problems in Syria and so forth. That were, you know, these environmental issues were quite well spread around the world, and people were in countries with various backgrounds were engaged. But I mean, they still are, of course, but the wars in Syria and Afghanistan and Iraq and Iraq have, you know, kind of messed things up.
Anything else, anyone? David?
Just want to say one thing. David Corton on the UN is corrupt. He's right enough about that. But if you stay in the loop, this stuff with the Sustainable Development Goals is really quite wonderful. And the UN is absolutely right on the mark about what needs to happen, should happen, and is happening. There isn't even remotely enough institutional infrastructure or secure financing, and they keep dancing around some form of taxation or fees to routinely finance these the goals, the manifestation of the goals, especially globally, rather than only in this or that nation state, which is still the way things work pretty much at the UN. And the Paris Climate Agreement and the 2030 goals, they're really focused on national plans, getting this nation state to do something and that nation stuff, each of them to do the right thing. But the overall vision of the 17 goals is wonderful. And if the United States government were even remotely putting its capital and influence toward those goals, we'd be in great shape. But I think Lucy is right. There was an incredible distraction with the war on terror, etc., and the whole thing that was trying to happen from the NGOs beginning to be more relevant in governance dissipated. And we got into wars as the main issue, and really. And so now they put that into the Sustainable Development Goals 2030, and it's kind of reactivated and reshaping itself and having a new relevance. And I think that's, we don't hear much about that in the United States, but in fact, the UN is doing the right thing. And increasingly, the rest of the planet is taking its kind of sense of itself and not depending on the United States to lead or even dominate, right? And so I think there's very positive energies and consciousness and goal setting, but the part about infrastructure that we're so strong on, that's not very satisfactory yet.